Hi everyone, thanks for coming back to our channel. This is episode 5 of the series The Human Condition. If you haven't seen the first 4 episodes, please feel free to go back and watch those. I think it would be helpful because we talk about quite some difficult concepts, scientific, spiritual and so on, that it's probably helpful to get the whole train of thought, so to speak, in order to follow the following episodes. So as always, there is no plan and I'm going to try and just wing it. I'm always I wanted to say that I'm very inspired by the comments that so far Jay made. Thank you for those. I think about them quite a bit, and I will probably touch upon some of your input today as well. I just wanted to, I had the idea of using my notebook for a quick demonstration, and I wanted to suggest that I think that there is different levels of existence. And I'm not sure if one can compare them with the types of dimensions we've been talking about before when we considered quantum physics and the amount of different dimensions that are proposed by quantum physics. But nevertheless, I'm going to try and, because, I'm just a regular human being. I'm not a scientist. I don't claim to know any more than you do. I'm just a human being trying to figure out what this experience is that I'm having, and that also maybe that you are having. So I have been asking myself these questions for all my life, and since I'm thinking about them anyway, I thought I might as well tape them on video and have you participate in this sort of thought experiment. And what I find really interesting is that, or what sort of brought me to this also was that in the recent past, maybe I think 20 years ago or so, there were these clear differences between, there was science, there was religion, there was esoterics and mysticism, maybe you could call that. And if you were interested in figuring out life, you found yourself, gravitating to either one of these very vast fields. Well, of course, I forgot philosophy. Sorry. And whatever field you went into, you tended to get stuck in that particular field. Now, so if you would be talking or thinking about or considering any, religious thought, it would be hard for you to translate that to a scientific view, or vice versa, and or you would be othered by proponents of science. And if, on the other hand, you were a philosopher, you would have to clearly distinguish yourself from religion and so on. So, and what I found is happening, or has been happening in the past couple of decades, is that no matter what field, the fields sort of got closer to each other, not only because there were, especially in science, there were a couple of very brave people who didn't much care about losing acclaim or clout by stating certain things, But it was more so that all these different fields sort of came to similar conclusions. And I still find myself, wanting to make sure that I go back to science wherever I can to sort of pick the latest science that I can find, and from people that do hold PhDs and so on, not because they have a claim, but because I think it's worth, considering just a very professional perspective. And what I also found in the past was that people who, let's say, who weren't philosophically inclined much, who didn't pay that much attention to language, and it's like when you're a philosopher, you really treasure language, you treasure definitions, and you want to be really clear about what you're speaking about and what you're not speaking about, and that has a lot of merit, because if you want to be sharing thoughts and ideas, then you have to be really clear in your speaking as well. And I always really respected philosophers for that trait. And when I looked to a lot of the esoteric content, let's say, I found myself inspired, but I always thought that they were very gracious with their definitions, and people coming from this kind of angle didn't seem to appreciate science, more than it would help them to propagate whatever their agenda. So I think that this is why, and mostly when it comes to quantum physics, I think everybody or a lot of people started talking about quantum physics, and one had the impression that there were a lot of shortcuts made, and things sort of got out of hand, and concepts started to become really modeled. And so this is probably why I always try to, in the description box to my videos, at least try to link to actual science and point to, lectures and articles and so on, for you to make up your own minds on the one hand, and also to point out that there's actual science, taking place regarding those topics that we're discussing here. Anyway, I just wanted to make that point real quick. So why did I bring out my notebook? I wanted to speak to these different, let's call them maybe layers of existence, and maybe that will help us to understand the dimensionality of things more, because it seems very hard to fathom, what other dimensions than the spatial dimensions plus the time dimension, what other dimension there could be, and how that would feel. And it's just that the human mind sort of cannot, or doesn't seem to be able to wrap we don't seem to be able to wrap our heads around what multidimensionality means. At the same time, on this channel, I hold the hypothesis that human beings are multidimensional beings. So we do experience the multidimensions, but we have a hard time talking about them or getting across what they might mean. So I thought I'd use an analogy. It just sort of came to me that I might be able to show you that this way. So I think that there's a level of existence where there is, and I might sound very esoteric right now, I'm aware of that, please bear with me. Not that esotericism is a bad thing, but nevertheless. But to be very simple and plain, I think there is a level of existence where there is just the quality maybe of light, much like these blank pages right here. So there is, maybe if you want to, if you need an analogy, imagine that right here what you're looking at is like an old television set where you still had these dials, you know, where you could sort of change the frequency slightly. So if you change the frequency on to one side, you just have snow, and then if you change it to the other side, you'd start to get an image. Then it would be probably black and white, and at one point you'd have a moving image in color. So it's a similar experiment, or it's a similar setup here. So I think there is a dimension of existence where there is just light, and no form, so to speak. And I was very inspired the other day when I heard someone say, I think I still have that YouTube link, I will link that in the description box. I saw a lot of videos recently, so I have to make sure I don't mix things up. But so he said that consciousness might be regarded as basic of a quality of the universe, such as electronic charge, or such as fundamental property such as, you know, mass or electronic charge or gravity. And I was reminded of that when I had that thought that there probably could be a dimension where there's predominantly just light. And then if you sort of turned the dial slightly, you'd probably start to see on a quantum level, just, it's almost like different waves. It would probably be like a huge ocean of just waves of possibility waves, that they're called possibility waves in quantum physics. So we would have a soup, much like this one, with just inference patterns and different origins. It's almost like you can picture a pond and somebody throws rocks in them, you know. That would actually be a nice meditation. I should do that. I should sit by a pond and just throw rocks in it and see what happens. So I'm sure there's a level of reality or a level of existence that is predominantly is these waves and interference patterns. And then if you turn the dial more, then there's a level of reality where there is atoms, electrons, particles, you know. And I think that's when we start talking about three-dimensionality, i.e. space and time. Because the minute you start talking about particles and you're in this, and you're on this level of existence, then a particle that is stable enough would have to be, if you wanted to move the particle from here to here, it would have to overcome a certain distance, i.e. a spatial distance, and that would require a certain amount of time. So now we are in time-space. And in that same four-dimensional space, of course, there's also these, if you want to call these atoms or particles, and then you move up to microbes, you know, like like very small living organisms and micro objects, and if you then moved up to macro objects, you would at some point land at the human being. Sorry for that simple drawing. And the human being with its very refined brain, right? And if we consider this sort of view of, if we consider this possibility that there are these different levels of existence, including light, and that not only for the fact that the brain also exists on this quantum level, but not only because it's part of this, or it's really hard to explain. I'm sorry. So anyway, if you consider this view that there might be these different levels of existence, your perspective on individuality in macro objects tends to change. And I'm going to try and explain what I mean by that. It's okay. It's one thing to say, well, we're all connected somehow. I mean, that's nice for someone to say, but then what does it mean? And where does it start? Like, where do I start, and where do I end, and where do you start? So I think if you take such a human being with that sort of developed brain that we all have, it would be logical to think that this organism is able to experience not only other if we consider this to be a macro object, and I hope you don't take issue for my calling it an object and not a subject, because in this discussion it would make it way more complicated if we called it subject. So let's just focus on the materiality of the human being. So if you take this kind of macro object and you appreciate that that the macro object, by way of its sensory organs, seeing, hearing, touching, and so on, is able to perceive another macro object, it then makes sense to say that by that very perception of another macro object, and by the repeated perception of something other, seemingly other, since it's localized, it's in a different location than the first macro object, it would make sense that by the repeated perception of this object by this object, the idea of subjectivity or dualism would arise, right? And I mean a very firm duality that would suggest that there are clear boundaries between these two objects. They are not interrelated whatsoever, and I think, and I can appreciate that this would happen, because even if it's just an illusion, it's probably going to be a very strong illusion in the mind of that macro object. Now, bear with me. Let's go back to these different levels of existence. So when we put it like this, we are on this level of existence. Now remember how we said there's another level of existence where the lines between one object and another object aren't so clear-cut anymore. And I mean, that's just scientifically proven at this point. Is that when, as you go further and further down in any physical object, you realize that there is a point where even particles become wave functions, or I shouldn't say become, but where it's clear that particles also are at the same time always wave functions, and the particle is a particle because the wave function collapsed temporarily for a certain period of time. This wave function collapsed into being a material object, but it might as well collapse back. So in a way, we could then glean that even if we are, as humans, in a physical body, and that physical body seems to have clear boundaries that can be overstepped, unfortunately, and we should always be conscious of the possibility that those boundaries aren't so clear-cut as we always seem to think. And if you start to sort of go with that thought, or take that thought and run with it, you might as well think that even in macro objects such as human beings, there's a possibility for overlap, for, if you want to say, energetic overlap. Not in this 4D space that we mainly experience. I mean, I don't walk around out there and see, tons of waves and interference patterns. I'm not saying that, but I walk around out there and I experience what I can best describe as energy or energies, and since I do, and since I do on a regular basis, and I don't know what, I have no idea why. I don't know if that has anything to do with the way my particular brain is sort of structured, and if that has anything to do with autism, I have no idea. Would be probably a nice topic for research at one point. But so it just seems that I feel that this is going on, and I'm trying to figure out why and how that could be going on and what that means, and so there might be the possibility that this is what we proposed in an earlier video, is that as human beings, we actually are able to experience and to experience in our physicality, to experience these other dimensions that are, for lack of a better term, probably just energetic levels of experience. And don't ask me what they are, because I don't know either. I also said, and I'm still struggling with that question myself, at one point I remember I said that it doesn't make any sense for me personally to think that in the next level up, so to speak, there's still this concept of individuality that we have when we're in 4D and in a physical body. And I don't think that on that level we have that concept of being separate from another. And I also suggested that that's where I think this whole idea of self or ego or I, when you sort of tune into that level of existence, then that becomes unimportant. That loses. It's almost like you can't pay with that kind of currency on that level, you know. So that it's no use because there's no significance of these concepts on this kind of level of existence. I know there is significance to it here in this 4-dimensional space. I mean, a lot of it apparently, but it sort of loses its meaning when you move up, or I shouldn't say up because that implies value, but when you move sort of to this other or into this other dimension. Anyway, I hope this can inspire you a little bit, and I will pick it up here in our next episode, and then I would very much like to take on some of Jay's comments and discuss those in more detail. Until then, take care and have a wonderful Christmas time. Bye.